Hello everybody and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today we're going to be talking about a creation trick. What creationist trick are we going to discuss today? Just lie. That's the trick. It's not subtle, but it's something creationists do all the time. The problem for creationism, in particular young earth creationism, is that it is wrong. It is refuted by genetics, history, archaeology, astronomy, lots of different fields. Now, this does not stop creationists from making their arguments, but it does cause a bit of a problem if you're trying to make accurate arguments. The solution, such as it is to this problem, is to just lie. You'll see creationists all the time just like making stuff up. You'll find creationists misrepresenting the peer-reviewed literature. They'll lie about what people mean when they say something. They'll lie about what they and other people have said, just directly straight up. Say, you said X when they actually said the opposite of that. And so we're going to look at some examples of this behavior here today. Our first example comes to us from Dr. John Sanford, as he misrepresents Moto Kimura's work on population genetics. Dr. John Sanford is the author of a book called Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, which purports to show how a old Earth timeline is impossible because the human genome is degenerating, and if we'd actually been around for 200,000 to 300,000 years, we'd be extinct. Everything about this idea is wrong. I've got several videos on it. You can check those out. I want to focus on a specific claim concerning mutation effects. And so in the third edition of Genetic Entropy, Dr. Sanford writes, it can very reasonably be argued that random mutations are never good. Now, he actually amended this. I think he said are virtually never good in the later editions, but I have the third edition, and that's the quote that I have. Now, this assertion is based on the fitness effects distribution from a 1979 paper by Moto Kimura, who's one of the most important population geneticists of the 20th century. His work was all neutral theory. Sanford writes, Kimura obviously considered beneficial mutations so rare as to be outside of consideration. In other words, Kimura said beneficial mutations basically never happen, so we can disregard them. The problem is that this is the opposite of what Kimura said. In that 1979 paper, he wrote, we disregard beneficial mutants. This is an oversimplification, but a model assuming that beneficial mutations also arise at a constant rate, independent of environmental changes, leads to unrealistic results. Let me take a minute to unpack this. Kimura's model basically was looking at how neutral mutations that don't affect fitness, how they accumulate in a population. And in his model, he basically just let them accumulate at a constant rate. Now, if you also do that for beneficial mutations, you get unrealistic results because beneficial mutations don't accumulate at a constant rate. Eventually, you hit a fitness peak, at which point beneficial mutations are no longer accumulating. So to deal with this problem, Kimura just said, you know what, we're not going to worry about the beneficial mutations. My model is just dealing with linear accumulation. Beneficials don't work that way, so we're just going to toss them out. He went on to say, the selective disadvantage of such mutants, by which he means mutations that have very, very small effects on biochemical function, but no effect on fitness, will easily be taken care of by adaptive gene substitutions that must occur from time to time. Now, in this sentence right here, which is from that same paper, the phrase adaptive gene substitutions, that means beneficial mutations. So he's saying right there in the paper, beneficial mutations occur, we're just not going to consider them in my simplified model. Okay, that's what Kimura is saying. Now, Sanford completely ignores this, even after Kimura's actual rationale was directly pointed out to him. This was over the course of an electronic back and forth. I've linked the relevant part of that discussion down below. In that discussion, Sanford wrote, again, after this had been pointed out to him, while Kimura did not include a beneficial mutation curve, I suspect he would have drawn it much as I did. In other words, we're going to ignore what Kimura said, and we're going to pretend that he agrees with me, even though he very clearly does not. The takeaway here is that John Sanford is lying about Kimura's work even after he's been corrected on it publicly more than once. The second bit of dishonesty I want to document here is the chronic lying we see about the ENCODE project. The ENCODE project was an effort to document all of the elements of the human genome and their biochemical activity and function. Creationists love ENCODE because they don't like the idea of junk DNA. And in particular, they love this original paper from ENCODE, an integrated encyclopedia of DNA elements in the human genome from 2012. Here are the central findings of this paper. The vast majority, 80.4% of the human genome, participates in at least one biochemical RNA and or chromatin-associated event. So you have about 80% of the genome being biochemically active as the central finding here. This is extremely frequently misrepresented. One particular example is from a young Earth creationist YouTuber who goes by Standing for Truth in his book, Universal or Separate Ancestry. Now, before I get into this, I want to point out that Standing for Truth was recently caught misrepresenting a different paper, claiming it showed one thing, but cutting off his quote that he was using right before the authors in the second half of the sentence said the exact opposite of the thing he was claiming. And I got the video down below documenting that little bit of shenanigans as well. This is, I think, less egregious than that, but this is also pretty bad. So Standing for Truth writes, we now know that ENCODE has discovered that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA was transcribed into RNA. This is a very specific claim. 80% of the human genome, I should say 80% of the non-coding DNA in the human genome, which is about 98.5% of the total genome, is transcribed into RNA. But what does that actual paper say on the subject? Well, here's their actual results that are relevant to this question. 62% of genomic bases are reproducibly represented in sequenced long RNA molecules or GenCode exons. Most transcribed bases are within or overlapping annotated gene boundaries, that is, intronic. And only 31% of bases in sequenced transcripts were intergenic. This is in direct conflict with what Standing for Truth writes. It's not 80% that's transcribed to RNA, it's 62%. And of that 62%, most of it is introns or exons. We've known that introns, despite being non-coding, are transcribed to RNA. We've known that for decades. This is like mid-20th century stuff. This is not new. Now, the rest of that stuff is mostly derived from transposable elements, mobile genetic elements, things like retroviruses or DNA or RNA transposons. So we would expect some residual transcription activity in those various parts of the genome as well. But is it most of that rest of the genome? No. I've had conversations with Standing for Truth where I've pointed this out to him, and I know other people have pointed this out to him as well. Initially, you could say, okay, he didn't read the paper carefully, he didn't quite get it, whatever. But at some point, you go from being mistaken to being dishonest after you've been corrected so many times, and that's what's going on right here. The third instance I want to talk about is kind of a fun one. This is looking at lactase persistence, which is the ability to digest lactose throughout your adult life. It's the opposite of lactose intolerance. And I want to focus here on AIG's, that's Answers in Genesis, Dr. Kevin Anderson, because he can't seem to keep his explanation for lactose persistence straight. In this first clip I'm going to show you, he's having a debate with Jackson Wheat, and I've linked the full debate below. He says that we know lactase persistence has to do with the MCM6 gene, but we don't really know why. We just know that it's something in that gene. The MCM6 gene is upstream from the lactase gene.
Well, you challenged that you said that this MCM6 doesn't do what I was saying it does, yeah. But of course I didn't give any explanation of what it does. The papers, the literature that has done experimentation on trying to determine lactose persistence finds that MCM6 acts in a regulatory way to the extent that if you have mutations somewhere in MCM6, you're more likely to have lactose persistence. What the exact relationship is of MCM6 to lactose is still not fully understood.
Now, the interesting thing is, here's a clip from last year, from 2019. This is a presentation to a creationist audience, and again, I've linked the full video down below. Dr. Anderson claims that the MCM6 gene codes for a repressor, and mutations to that gene inactivate the repressor, allowing for lactase persistence.
The original is that in the original, meaning what Adam and Eve were, okay, is once you move through puberty, so you're post-puberty, there is another gene called MCM6 that makes a protein that blocks the expression of the lactase gene, and you do not make the lactase enzyme, and therefore you are what we would call lactose intolerant. You don't digest that sugar very well. But there is a mutation that was introduced into the population, and that mutation interferes with the ability of MCM6 to make that repressor protein, and so you continue through your adult life to make lactase, and you can continue to drink milk.
Now, the first thing I want to note here is that MCM6 doesn't code for a repressor, it codes for a helicase subunit, and this is not new. This is old news. We know what MCM6 does, and Dr. Anderson is just misrepresenting it there. But the interesting thing is I think he knows he's lying to that audience. I think what he's doing here is lying to a friendly audience. Because if we go back to the debate clip very briefly, he almost says repressor and then he catches himself. Take a look.
Finds that MCM6 acts as in a regulatory way.
So what I think is going on here is he says one thing to a non-creationist audience, and he says another thing to a creationist audience, and he knows he's lying to that creationist audience, but he doesn't care because he's just telling people what they want to hear. And frankly, if I was a member of that creationist audience and I was being treated that way, I'd be pretty mad, but that's just me. The last example of creationist dishonesty I want to talk about here is deceptive video editing. This example comes to us from Raw Matt, another Young Earth creationist YouTuber, and I'm going to ask that you indulge me a little bit here because this one is actually specifically about me, but it's kind of fun, so let's do it. Raw Matt recently published a video purporting to show that I lied about having read Replacing Darwin, a book by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. I will say up front, I did not lie, and Matthew is lying about it. So the first problem is distorted dates. So let's look at this first video clip.
Have you read that book?
I have not read the new one, Replacing Darwin. No, I have not read Replacing Darwin. So this video from Raw Matt was uploaded on August 9th. You can see right there, August 9th, 2020. In this video, he zooms in on a live stream I appeared on, and he makes a point to show that it was streamed 5 days ago. Here's the thing. That stream aired on June 22nd. Now, I'm not great at math, but I think June 22nd is more than 5 days before August 9th. The second part to this, the part where I said I have read the book, that was in another live stream. That aired on June 28th. Now, because I'm a nerd and I keep track of these things, I got a spreadsheet, I can tell you exactly when I read the book, Replacing Darwin. I read it that week between those two streams. I actually finished it earlier in the day on June 28th. So when I said on June 22nd I hadn't read the book, I was telling the truth. When I said on June 28th I had read the book, I was also telling the truth because by then I had in fact read the book. Now the second problem, and the bigger problem here, is deceptively editing the videos to make it look like I said something that I didn't say. So let's go back to Raw Matt's video and see what else he has on me. When he talks to a scientific audience, he knows that what he says in the book is ridiculous and will be laughed at. In the whole thing with the mitochondrial Eve time to most recent common ancestor that Jensen does, that is not intended for a scientific audience. I have not read the new one, Replacing Darwin. No, I have not read Replacing Darwin. He knows that what he says in the book is ridiculous and will be laughed at. I have not read the new one, Replacing Darwin. No, I have not read Replacing Darwin. He knows that what he says in the book is ridiculous and will be laughed at. Now, this looks bad, right? This looks like I said I hadn't read the book, and then I talked about the book anyway. I hadn't read the book, but let me characterize the book. That looks bad and dishonest, right? Let's watch the full clip and see what I actually said. Yeah, I think that actually is a good illustration of part of the problem here, which is that these arguments that we're responding to as scientific arguments, and I said this when I was talking to Sal, that we're going to treat this as a scientific hypothesis. And even though Sanford kind of winks and nods in that direction, that book is not intended for a scientific audience. And when he talks to a scientific audience, he knows that what he says in the book is ridiculous and will be laughed at.
Yeah.
It's not intended to be taken seriously. And that goes for a lot of people. That goes for Purdom. That goes for Jensen. In the whole thing with the mitochondrial Eve time to most recent common ancestor that Jensen does, that is not intended for a scientific audience. Because reading what he says right in that original paper from 2015, that I don't know, maybe, but we're not really sure. He says it right there in black and white, but you need to know what to look for in what he's saying. And to a non-scientific audience, what he's saying, it doesn't come off as a disclaimer, but to a scientific audience, he right there in the discussion has a disclaimer.
Have you read that book?
I have not read the new one, Replacing Darwin. No, I have not read Replacing Darwin. So the actual discussion here, turns out I was talking about a different book by a different author. Coincidentally, Genetic Entropy by Dr. John Sanford. So the takeaway here is that Raw Matt is not honest. He was recently caught fraudulently claiming a blog post of his was published in PLOS Biology, and the link to the video on that is below. And he also deceptively edits video clips to distort what people have said and when they said it. Now, this is not super unusual behavior for creationists, all things considered, but it is notable for its brazenness and its shamelessness. And while Raw Matt may have no shame, I think his collaborators and colleagues who continue to work with him on an ongoing basis might want to reconsider their partnership in light of his dishonest behavior. So, to summarize, faced with a losing hand, creationists frequently turn to a simple trick. Just lie about stuff. Here, I've documented a number of specific examples. Now, it leads to an interesting question. If creationists are right, why do they have to do this? If you got the goods, just like win the debate. The answer, of course, is that creationists can't. So in lieu of good persuasive arguments, we get dishonesty, as I've documented here. So, a creation trick? Just lie. One more thing to watch out for when you are debating creationists. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Don't get fooled.